This is the 28 Minutes of Sanity podcast. We're glad you're listening. We're glad you're watching. We have a guest today that I'm excited to tell you about in just a second, but just want to tell you that you can find us on Twitter. We are at 28min of sanity on Twitter, or if you want to send us a note, send an email to 28minutesofsanity@gmail.com. I'm really excited to have a guest with us today. I think most of our listeners are from Nebraska. Most of our listeners are connected to Heartland Church. If you have a good long memory, in the spring of 2013, we had a guest named Michael Spencer come visit our church, and I haven't stayed in close touch with Michael over the years, but I just really appreciate Michael and what he does. Michael is a pro-life apologist, and he's agreed to join us for an interview today. Michael, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, JJ. Thanks for having me.
Good. Thanks for being on. We've got some hard questions for you, Michael, but first, we Nebraskans are a little territorial, a little provincial. I'm curious, what do you remember about your time, your visit out to Central City? Do you remember much about us?
Yeah, I have two specific one is fairly general, but two memories. The general one is the warmth and the hospitality that you and the church showed me. Mm-hmm. It was great. I actually felt like I was at home because you guys are kind of small town and I live in small town Ohio, so there was a lot of similarity there as well. But the other thing that I remember when I left, and I don't remember if that was a Sunday morning or a Saturday, or I don't remember what the occasion exactly was. I think I'd done a workshop and maybe spoke in your pulpit too. But I remember when I left, you had 5 or 6 or 7 high school students that followed me out to the car because they were so interested in the subject that they wanted to continue talking. And it really, I was fairly new to this. Now I've seen this kind of thing many times, but I was fairly new at that time to my full-time pro-life apologetics role. And it really warmed my heart to see high school students that cared so deeply about the issue, which was, I think, a great testament to your church and its leadership. So.
Yeah, and that I don't remember that, but I believe it because that's just the grace of God in our church. We've had some great kids, some great high schoolers over the years, yeah. And so the fact that happened and that you remember it does not surprise me in the least. In the lead up here, Michael, I had a little Nebraska quiz prepped for you. I'm going to go easy on you, and I'm only going to ask you one of those questions. All right.
Just real quick, I know when I was helping with youth group, it was pretty amazing. We had a lot of deep discussions, and a lot of the kids were really into just thinking hard about Christ and wanting to know information. Yeah, so that's the culture that, again, that's really a gift that we have here, but it doesn't surprise me. So, yeah, Paul was at that time really involved in volunteering with our youth ministry as well. So one kind of Nebraska-based question here, Michael. Have you ever eaten a Runza?
It's entirely possible, given the fact that I don't even know what one is. Okay. Perhaps I've eaten one at some point. Enlighten me.
Okay. Well, it's kind of a meat cabbage baked into a pouch, and it's connected to our German heritage here. And there's a chain of fast food restaurants all across Nebraska called Runza, and so. Oh, really? Okay. Yeah,
I missed that cultural experience. Okay. You'll have to have me back.
We would love to do that. The Runza will be on me next time you.
I will look forward to it. I'll hold you to that.
Okay, perfect. All right. So let's dive in here, Michael. Can you just lead us up? Just give us a bit of your story. How did you get wherever you want to start the story is fine, but how did you get to the place where you could be called a pro-life apologist?
Yeah, well, I like a lot of Americans, I sort of defaulted late. I was raised in a very good home, but it was not a Christian home, at least not until later when my mom and dad came to Christ. But I had defaulted to kind of a classic pro-choice position. Like a lot of Americans, I knew that abortion was bad. I knew it was wrong, but I saw it as a necessary evil. But what happened was a couple of things. Most notably is I came to faith in Christ when I was 21. And the church that I started attending in the Detroit area where I grew up showed a film about 8 or 9 months into my newfound Christian faith. So I'd only been going to the church for that long, about 8 or 9 months. And they showed the film, The Silent Scream. And some of your viewers, perhaps the older viewers, will remember that film. It was kind of a groundbreaking film that came out just into 1984. And I saw that night, it was a Wednesday night in the church service, and I saw for the very first time with my own eyes what abortion did to little boys and girls, and I couldn't believe it. And so that profoundly impacted me. And long story short is that that was a radical conversion for me. Nothing else needed to happen for me to come to the conclusion that abortion was evil and that there was no justification for it. So that was a game changer. But then I went on to serve in pastoral roles for a total of 23 years, 7 years in youth ministry roles, and then 16 years in 2 different senior pastor roles in 2 different churches. And this burden that was really, it really started in me back in 1984, just continued to grow as I saw even close pastor friends of mine who were genuine guys, committed to God's word, committed to their flocks, but for some reason, just very quiet about the abortion issue. And so that burden just continued to kind of grow in me. And so 10 years ago now, I was invited by Scott Klusendorf, the president and the founder of Life Training Institute. I was invited to join that team, the speaking team. I served with them for about 8 years, I believe it was. And before starting this ministry, Project LifeVoice, 2 years ago. So that's kind of the journey in a nutshell.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. I'm going to jump just directly from that story, and I bet we're going to jump back and forth between some issues connected to the pro-life movement and a little bit of your story. But I just you mentioned just being burdened for the cause of the unborn and pro-life. I'm just going to give you a little scenario and want to see how you would respond to it. So imagine that for some, you're sharing an Uber ride with somebody, and it's only going to be like 5 or 10 minutes long, and you exchange pleasantries, and they find out that they find out what you do, and they say something like, "Well, that sounds fine. I'm libertarian. I just want the government to stay out of that issue." How would you just have a little bit of time? How would you use that time to respond to that kind of statement, Michael?
Well, that's interesting because the Libertarian Party platform basically says that this should be left to individuals to decide. It's the classic pro-choice position that the Libertarian Party holds to. I would ask a series of questions. The first thing I think I would ask is, where do human rights come from? We really have 2 options. Either human rights come from the state, that the state grants these rights, that this is some benevolent act on their part, and they grant the rights, which of course means that they can then take those rights away from us. Or the other option is that human rights, basic human rights, come from God, that God has given those, and that the role of the state at that point is not to grant those rights, but merely to protect those rights. So I would try to establish that first, see if there was common ground, and there would almost certainly be at that point common ground that human rights, if they might not argue that human rights come from God, but they would at least, I think, argue that they're innate in us, that they're part of who we are. They may not, in other words, they may not have a good reason, a good way of grounding those rights, but chances are that there would be some common ground there. The second question that I would ask is, well, then who gets basic human rights? And of course, the obvious answer to that is human beings. And so the final question I would ask is, well, when do they get those? And so our argument as pro-lifers would be that human rights come to us when we come to be, and we don't come to be at birth, we come to be at conception. So what's underlying this question that this libertarian Uber driver has asked of me is really, they're begging the question. They're operating from an assumption. And the assumption that they're operating from is that the unborn child is not a valuable human person. They may acknowledge the humanity, the biological humanity of the unborn child, but don't recognize the personhood. Either way, that would be where I would go. I would try to establish, what is the unborn? That's the $1 million question. Because if we can demonstrate biologically or from the science of human embryology that the unborn is a distinct, living, and whole human being, and then if we can demonstrate morally that there's no moral difference between the Uber driver at 35 years old and the embryo that he once was, then we clearly come to the conclusion that everybody deserves legal protection. So I'm sympathetic. I'm not libertarian in my political views, but I'm sympathetic on some level to the idea, the libertarian view that government should be small, that freedoms should be large. But the question is, who gets those freedoms? Who gets these liberties, and how do we get them? So I would try to establish that groundwork with that person.
Okay, sure.
What about
ahead,
with the groundwork? You said if they say it is a life and they agree with you, but they're like, I don't, there's memes out there about gay abortions, and they just say, well, you can't force me to like hook up to somebody that was in a car accident and support their life. Why should I have to support a baby's life?
Sure. Well, that's a little different, because hooking up to somebody in a car accident is an unnatural hookup. That's an unnatural relationship. For a mother to be hooked up, so to speak, to use that language, to the unborn child is a natural relationship. That baby is developing precisely where it should be developing. And so, I think that's what we have to establish there is that there's, because perhaps you're familiar with Judith Jarvis Thompson's famous violinist argument, which is basically the same kind of a thing where somebody is kidnapped, you're kidnapped, and you're hooked up against your will to this famous violinist who is dependent upon your body to filter his body. But the good news is you're only going to be there for 9 months. And this goes on. But the idea here is that these parallels are drawn to sort of suggest that parents don't have basic moral duties to their own children, that there's no difference in the relationship between a mother and her child and a stranger who has hooked up to you against your will. So I think that more could be said, but it's kind of a silly argument, and it undermines the idea that the unborn child is a distinct, living, and whole human being, and that those rights should come when that child came to be.
Yeah, for me, I'm not the smartest person in the world, according to myself. So to me, it just doesn't make sense why you would even think that. It's just, it is alive and it's your responsibility. Yeah. So well, I can't come up with an argument for it because I can't understand why they're even thinking that to begin with.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. Stephen Schwartz, pro-life author, said something to the effect, and I'll probably do a little injustice to his quote, but he said something to the effect that a woman would even see her unborn child as an intruder, again, kind of along the lines of the illustration that you posed of the car accident victim there, that she would even see her unborn child as an intruder is a moral harm already. That's a great travesty that we would even, and that's really where we've come as a nation is we now have generations, a couple of generations at least of men and women who see the unborn child as property, or somehow diminish the value of the unborn child, justifying killing it. And then, of course, you see all of these ridiculous bizarre thought experiments like Judith Jarvis Thompson's and others that have concocted these bizarre illustrations to justify killing unborn children.
Yeah, you do. That I still remember that violinist in a college philosophy textbook as being kind of representing, we've got the killer response to the standard pro-life position. And right. Guys, just in the few minutes we've been here, Michael, you've laid out kind of the barest, in simplest form, pro-life case. Paul, you brought up one of the toughest objections. We've kind of covered both ends of the spectrum so far here. Michael, I'm just curious, what objection to the pro-life case, because there's a number of them. When I talk about this issue, I've got a whole set of common questions that I'm kind of ready to respond to when I'm the one making the case. But in your experience, Michael, what are one or two of the most common objections that are most likely to trip up somebody who's not a trained pro-life apologist, somebody who understands that basic argument but hasn't thought through some of the details? Are there some that you want to address?
Yeah, I think probably the most difficult challenge that pro-lifers face, and I don't think it's a difficult challenge morally or intellectually, but I do think it's a very difficult challenge emotionally, and that is the challenge of rape. So, we often, and oftentimes this is, somebody will bring this challenge to us, not because they're trying to trip us up, which is frequently the case, but a lot of times people are just asking an honest question. Like I'll speak in churches, and somebody will come up to me afterwards who's actually pro-life, who really is genuinely pro-life. But they'll say, yeah, but what about rape? Suppose a 13-year-old girl is raped, conceives a child against her will. Would you pro-lifers be so insensitive as to force that young girl to carry a baby to term that she didn't choose to have? So I think that's the biggest challenge that we face. It has a lot of emotion behind it, and I think pro-lifers oftentimes make a mistake in how they respond to this. So I assume you would like me to go ahead and give my response to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I would recommend a two-part response to this. The first thing that we want to do is we want to show real sympathy, real empathy. You never know who's asking the question, or oftentimes we don't know who's asking the question. It might be somebody who's actually been raped, or it might be somebody who has a loved one who's been raped. So it's not helpful to do what a lot of pro-lifers do, where they'll throw out a cold statistic and say, well, that's less than 1% of all abortions. And that's just not helpful at all. If you're the 13-year-old girl, or for that matter, the 25-year-old woman who has been raped and is now discovered, weeks later, that you're pregnant, that you're carrying a child that you didn't choose to conceive, I think we need to take the time in our conversations and really show empathy at that point. So I would do it this way. Now your audience may do this differently for obvious reasons here, but sure. I'll say something like, I'll ask the person's name, Mandy. Well, Mandy, I really appreciate the challenge because you're right. Sadly, in our culture, women and young girls are raped, and sometimes they do become pregnant as a result. And I'm married to a woman. I have 4 daughters and I have 4 granddaughters, and I can't imagine one of my loved ones being raped, and then weeks later discovering on top of this that they've got a child now that they didn't choose to have. So I think that's the first stop here. We've got to really show empathy, and empathy is not a checkbox. It's not there. I showed empathy, and now I can move on to what I really want to say. Empathy needs to be real. People are hurting, and people have stories and difficulty and all kinds of challenges. So that's the first step. The second step, though, is to answer the question by asking a question. Excuse me, to say something like this. Mandy, again, I appreciate the challenge, but isn't the real question, how should a civilized society treat innocent members of society who remind us of a painful event? Should we kill them? You see, the question in the case of rape, where a child has been conceived, the question is not how was one conceived, but was one conceived? And so this brings us back to that question, what are the preborn? So, JJ, I know you, but I don't know you well. I don't know how you were raised. I don't know any of your background.
Right.
So I don't know the circumstances. I'm not privy to the circumstances under which you were conceived. Now, maybe you were conceived by parents who loved each other very much. Maybe you were conceived by parents who fought all the time. Maybe you were conceived out of wedlock, and maybe you were conceived through the violent act of rape. But regardless, none of that has anything to do with your value or your identity. And so I just don't think it's right to give the death penalty to innocent children for the crimes of their guilty fathers. I think the real insensitivity here with this question is not on the part of pro-lifers who would deny a rape exception in our laws, but rather on the part of pro-choicers who think that we ought to give the death penalty to the innocent child for the crimes of the guilty father. And by the way, our Supreme Court has actually ruled that we can't even give the death penalty to the rapist, except under extreme extenuating circumstances. And so this is bizarre that we can give the death penalty to the child who gets no day in court, no jury, no attorney. It's really unfortunate. So the question is not how was one conceived, but was one conceived?
And it's something I heard too.
We can love them both.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
I would say something I heard on a podcast one time. I can't remember who it was, but they've had the argument too, just to kind of whittle down what you can talk about for reasoning's sake, is just ask them, say if you take that 20% that is rape and incest, and let's say, okay, I agree with that, just for the sake of argument, let's talk about the other percentage that's not that. Do we still have it or not? And they'll say, and then that takes that out of the argument, so they'll still try and argue something different.
Yeah, so the honest inquirer would be more easily satisfied, but the person who's just trying to trip you up and make you look insensitive, make you look uncaring to rape victims, that's a great strategy with them to say, well, look, let's suppose we grant the 1%. Let's suppose that we grant a rape exception, I should say. Will you join me in agreeing that the other 99% of abortions are morally wrong? And they will almost, again, the person who's just out to get you will almost always say no. And that's when you say, well, then why'd you bring up rape? I mean, if that's really your position, then why do you need to use or exploit rape victims in order to bolster your position? So yeah, you raise a great point there, Paul.
Yeah, and Michael, let me that answer to me is really satisfying, and really it feels like you've done your homework. You've reframed the issue in such a way that you can help people think carefully about it. I've had students ask me things like, a student might hear that response, somebody who's already persuaded and appreciates, and just say, oh my goodness, this guy said everything I wish I could say in that moment. How do I get from the spot where I kind of intuitively know there is an answer to being able to do what you just did? What counsel would you give somebody who wants to get a little closer to being able to articulate what you just did?
Well, a couple of things, and this is, I appreciate you serving me up a nice softball to promote my ministry. But this is what we do. Project LifeVoice, we go into churches, schools, a lot of right to life groups, conferences, and so on and so forth. And we help people we do seminars, workshops called Life Defenders, where we actually help the audience make the case for life by appealing to the science of human embryology, again, to make the case that the unborn child, according to embryologists, is a distinct, living, and whole human being from day one, and then to appeal to basic moral reasoning to make the case that there is no moral difference between, say, you, the adult, and you, the embryo. In fact, the only 4 differences, as Stephen Schwartz points out, there are only 4 of them. He packages this really nicely in a little acronym called SLED. Just remember SLED, S-L-E-D. This S stands for size. The L stands for level of development. The E stands for environment, and the D stands for degree of dependency. Those are the 4 differences that pro-choice people typically appeal to justify killing you in that earlier stage of your development. And we can quickly see that those are not good reasons to kill anybody at any stage of their development. And so we walk people through this. So that would be one thing. Now, that may not be real practical, for somebody to bring me out there or whatever. But the other thing that I would advise is that they read the book by Scott Klusendorf called The Case for Life. I think it's probably the best overall popular level pro-life apologetics work out there. The Case for Life by Scott Klusendorf. He lays it out for you. He deals with the rape challenge in there. And I think that would be extremely helpful to your audience.
Yeah. If I could just add on to that, you mentioned Case for Life by Scott Klusendorf. I've got that book. It is outstanding. It's really well done, really clearly written. Yep. I said I've got that book. I loaned it to someone a few years ago, and I can't remember who, and I never got it back. But I do highly recommend it.
It was not me.
It was not Paul. Speaking of books, incidentally, Case for Life is wonderful. Scott, I saw a couple of years ago on Facebook, endorsed the book Unaborted Socrates by Peter Kreeft. I think I'm saying his name right. And that's excellent. But another book that I just got my hands on this morning is, I'm going to hold it up, Humanly Speaking.
Oh, bless you, JJ.
True story, Michael. I was going to be more ready. This was supposed to show up yesterday. And we had a tornado warning in Central City yesterday, and that kind of threw all plans out the window. Thankfully, we made it through okay. Nothing, we didn't have a moment kind of like some folks in Arkansas and Kentucky did recently. But I just got my hands on this morning, so it showed up. And
all right, well, I'm going to give you 24 hours, and I want a 2-page double-spaced book report from you.
Okay, all right, I'll get right on that as soon as we sign off. But
here you will.
What I'm saying is, I would say this even if you weren't listening, Michael, but I've cracked it just a bit and read the opening. It's really well written. But I'm gonna give you kind of a tough question. I mentioned how much I like Case for Life, how much I like Unaborted Socrates. Why would, if I didn't know you and appreciate you and your ministry, what sets this book apart? Why would I want to keep reading this one when there's already some good resources out there?
Sure. Yeah. And the 2 books that you've mentioned are phenomenal. And there's so many others that belong in that category as well. Well, I can tell you my book, I wrote my book, with the desire to bring clarity to the role of the church in an abortion supportive culture. And to do that really by unmasking a lot of the destructive thinking that has effectively resulted in in sort of creating two classes of human beings, even within the church in America. So one class, of course, being those that we value and protect, and another class being, those that we regard as unworthy of our gospel influence and ignore. And a burden of mine has been that, and I don't want to overstate this, I don't want to be harsh, but I think it's fair to say that many, many churches in America have an awful lot in common with the abortionist or the abortion industry. You see, the abortionist looks at the unborn child and says, that child is inconvenient, so I can justify aborting it. Whereas many, many churches, practically speaking, through their silence, are communicating a similar position, that the unborn child is inconvenient and not worthy of our attention. And so this has been a burden of mine. And so I wrote the book, Humanly Speaking, again, it's subtitled The Evil of Abortion, The Silence of the Church and the Grace of God, to really attack that argument and to really bring dignity and worth to the unborn child, and to really lay out what is the role of the church in an abortion culture. So I do that in one of the chapters there in the book. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I appreciate that. What I've seen, I've been thinking through as I've listened to what you've said. In your answer to when Paul raised that rape exception, in your answer to that, you kind of covered two major areas. You talked about, in general, showing grace to the person asking the question, but then coming with truth as well. And truth means clarity and accuracy and things like that. And I can clearly tell from your website, and I don't think there's any shame. Project LifeVoice, I want to direct people there. ProjectLifeVoice.com. Did I get that right?
You did.
And I can just tell from what I know of you, from that website, from the book, it's your desire to communicate both. And I really appreciate that about you and what you're doing. And you've covered some of that. One thing that concern that I've had, and you've touched on this a fair bit, but I'd kind of want to hear a bit more. If I'm, and I've done this, and the other pastors in our church have done this, we've gotten up and we've spoken out on behalf of the unborn, and we try to do it carefully and with grace. But how would you, somebody young in seminary, somebody getting ready to preach and wants to touch on this, knowing, Michael, knowing that maybe there are or could be women or men with abortion in their past, what counsel do you give to the pastor, the pro-life apologist, so that so they don't miss something, so they don't get, they get everything right and still miss it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm glad for that question, because I think that really gets to the heart of how this needs to be addressed in the church. First of all, I think responding to abortion needs to be seen as a gospel issue. It's a loving your neighbor as yourself issue. And we're not just responding in our churches to the evil of abortion. We are doing that. When I say we should be doing that. The church should be, the shepherd should be lighting his pulpit on fire against this horrendous evil. We should be treating it with the same passion, the same sober-mindedness that we would if 2,000 plus toddlers were being killed every day in the United States. But we also are responding to this from a gospel perspective to those who have had abortions or have been responsible for them. And I don't think that these are competing interests. I think we can love innocent children and guilty adults with no conflict at all, no conflict whatsoever. It's funny, and I love the question, and I appreciate the question, because I know there is sort of an unspoken mentality or unspoken value or view, I guess, in the church that says that we've got to pick one or the other. We're going to either be that church that's all about the gospel, or we're going to be that church that's all about social action and fighting in the streets and so on and so forth. The reality is, Christ does not call us to pick one or the other. I'm not suggesting we should be fighting in the streets, but he's called us to be bold, to boldly proclaim and expose abortion for the evil that it is, and then to hold out the word of life to those who have had abortions or have been responsible for them. And so I would tell young seminarians that, and I would tell them that they should not shrink back on dealing with this. I do understand, and I'm very sympathetic to the concern that a lot of shepherds have that, well, if I speak out against this in my pulpit, I'm potentially going to offend women in my church who've had abortions or men who've been responsible for them. In other words, I'm going to inflict more injury, more harm on them. I understand that. And I suppose that ought to be, in fact, it ought to be that, let me just say directly, that ought to be a pastoral concern for every shepherd. But the greatest injury that we inflict on those in our churches who have had abortion experiences in the past is not when we speak out against this evil. It's when we go silent. Because when the church goes silent, we communicate one of two messages, and both are damaging, both regrettable. Either abortion's not so bad, or the gospel is not so good, or both. And let me just quickly unpack those two. Let's suppose I'm sitting in a church. I've been there 10, 20, 30 years. I've had an abortion 10, 20, 30 years ago. I never hear it mentioned, or very seldom ever hear it mentioned. I'm left to assume either abortion's not a big deal. My pastor speaks out against other sins like adultery and lying and gossip and slander, but he doesn't talk about abortion. God must be okay with this, must not be a big deal. Or I'm left to assume the opposite, that this is such a horrible thing, that this sin is so bad that it is unforgivable, that the blood of Christ, the sacrifice of Christ, is not adequate or sufficient to cover my sin. In other words, I am the unforgivable one. I have committed the unpardonable sin. Now, these are horrible messages, and the church must do better. Paul told the church, speak the truth in love. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to speak the truth in love. It's not enough for a pastor to just, and I don't want to be misunderstood by your audience, it's not enough for a pastor to get up and just boldly expose abortion for the evil that it is and just rail on about the evil of abortion. He's got to do it in a way that's redemptive. Now, that said, he should do it boldly and unapologetically with great passion. But in the same message, he needs to hold out hope and forgiveness to those through Jesus Christ for those who have been wounded by abortion. And I think when we do those two things, JJ, I know this, I know it from my own experience, that our congregation is going to respect us as shepherds for that. They're going to see that we're willing to go places that many churches are not willing to go. That our love for Christ and his word, our love for his people and for the unborn is going to compel us to bring the gospel to bear on this subject in the pulpit. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, very, very helpful. I don't know if this connects or not, but your answer kind of brought me back to something I made a note of. I did start reading that intro that you wrote, and you mentioned something called the Manslow Moment, and I don't want to spoil anything from the book, fine. But just a couple thoughts on that. As I read that, I had a nearly identical incident when I was in junior high, and it brought back some memories. But then it's as I've been thinking about that, over the course of the day, in that moment, you wrote about watching bullying happen, and in hindsight, wishing you had done something. Right? Is that a decent summary? And so you spend your life kind of working through that tension of why didn't I speak up? And in what I'm hearing in your answer, you're handing us the answer to that question. It's tough to speak up, but here is why we do, and here's motivation to do it and to do it properly. And so I just appreciate that.
Thanks.
Yeah, Michael, I've got a couple of other questions. You've spoken, a fair bit of your ministry is encouraging pastors to speak up. For the non-pastor, for the person in the pew who's convinced. You've touched on this a bit, but you kind of know this. Nebraska is a red state in a red county. We're pretty well convinced, not completely, but pretty well convinced of the pro-life case. What for the non-pastor, for the layman who wants to advance the cause of the unborn in a way that honors Christ, in a way that brings out the gospel. Do you have one or two practical steps for the mom, for the school teacher, for the police officer, for the farmer?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we can't give away what we don't possess. I mean, that's just a basic truism in life. We can't give away what we don't possess. If we don't possess a deep conviction about the value and the inestimable worth of every human being at every stage of their development, then abortion for us is going to be just another issue. One of many issues. Yeah, who cares, kind of thing. And if we want to raise up a generation of young people, first of all, if we want to have an impact ourselves directly on the abortion debate here in the United States, if we want to be a voice for the voiceless, we need to speak up. But if we want to raise up a generation of young people, like I encountered at Heartland Church, who are passionate about this, who are going to go off in their workplaces, off to the university and off into their careers, and give voice to the voiceless. They need to see that in us as adults. We need to be setting that example. And we can start that when our children are very young with a simple reading of Horton Hears a Who, and helping our 4-year-old understand that every human being matters, black, white, rich, poor, Jew, Gentile, born and unborn. So that's important. But I think even as our children grow older, particularly when they get into our teen years, we need to raise the right kind of rebels. And, every teenager, well, maybe not every teenager, but I think most teenagers, it's in us. It's in our sinful, fallen nature that we want to rebel, whether that's against God or society or the church or whatever. And I don't think the church has done a very good job of harnessing those urges in young people to give them something to rebel against, something good, or I should say something evil to rebel against, instead of them rebelling against good, give them something evil to rebel against. Again, it may not be practical for you. I don't remember where the nearest abortion clinic is in proximity to your church, but when I was pastoring in Fort Wayne, Indiana, many years ago, our children were young. We have 5 now, but we had 4 at the time. And my wife and I raised our children outside of the abortion clinic, which was located literally 1 block south of where our church was at. And we were there every Thursday morning praying for young women going in, young men going in, praying for their babies, interacting with the abortion clinic staff and escorts who were pro-choice escorts who were outside. And this was an eye-opening experience for my children. And they grew up with a passion. Each one of them to this day has a deep conviction about the sacredness of human life. And 2 of them are involved in full-time pro-life work, which I'm not saying that necessarily has to be the goal, but I'm just saying that's the fruit of this. So I think we need to train our children to think biblically and to act passionately on this subject. What we don't need in our churches is more people who sort of give intellectual assent to the gospel, give intellectual assent to the wrongness of abortion, but don't act on it. So I think we need to not only train our young people to think rightly about this, I think we need to inspire them through our own engagement. So whatever that looks like, whether you've got a pregnancy center or an abortion clinic that you can go outside and pray outside of, or again, a pregnancy center that you can volunteer, whatever, I think we really need to be giving them an example to follow. And again, and I would also just add to that, backing up from that, and your church is already doing this, but the overwhelming majority of churches are not. And that is that our shepherds need to be setting this example. They need to be the Ezekiels and the Daniels in their pulpits, and they should be bold about it. And nobody at the end of that message against abortion should be left wondering where God or the pastor stand on that issue. The shepherd has a heavenly mandate to compel others on this subject, to do what he can. And again, I'm not diminishing the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives or anything like that, but our flocks need to see our shepherds on fire about this issue.
All right, that is really helpful. And our church has had a chance to do that last spring. Our group, we took our kids out to Salt Lake City, Utah, and one of the things that we got to do there is pray outside of a clinic right next to the University of Utah and interact, help out some of the local pro-life community there. We've taken some people, not lately, I guess, but a few years ago when some of the, I believe it's David Dallett and some of his videos were prominent. There was a rally and a few of us went down and prayed in front of the clinic there, which is about 100 miles away. But I appreciate those ideas. Michael, we're well over the 28-minute mark. I appreciate you sticking around for some bonus sanity for us.
Sure. Glad to do it.
Yeah. As we land the plane, as we kind of close out our time here, I guess one question I have is, and this is a little bit personal. I mean, personal to me, but I vacillate between, I'm on Twitter a lot, and I see things that give me extreme optimism for the cause of the unborn. And then I see other things that give me extreme pessimism. And when I'm pessimistic, my tendency is to say, well, why try? And when I'm overly optimistic, my tendency is to let up a little bit. Yeah. How would you just tell me, Michael, how should I be cautious not to, like, why should I be pessimistic or optimistic? And how do I maintain faithfulness between those two extremes? When I'll hear one commentator say, it looks like the cause is lost. There's no reason to even try at this point. We've moved so far beyond the pro-life issue in this nation. And then I'll hear on the news, there's a real chance that Roe could be overturned this year. Right. How do I not get caught up in the Twitter madness and just stay faithful? Do you have any counsel for me on that?
First of all, I sympathize with you because I can completely relate. I find myself vacillating between that cynicism and that hope as well. That's probably just part of the human condition, I guess, for us. But Jesus said something that he said a lot of things that have been encouraging me on this subject. Jesus said something that was really helpful, that became very helpful to me when I started this work nearly 10 years ago now. You know the story where Jesus explained that the poor you will always have with you. He said, the poor you will always have with you, which is an incredibly, when you think about it, when you just take that statement on its face, it's incredibly depressing. The poor you will always have with you. And yet in other places in the scripture, in the gospels, we see Jesus telling us to love the poor, to clothe them, to feed them, to care for them, to protect them. And so 9 or 10 years ago, when I started doing this work full time, I kind of took that as my own in order to keep from becoming despairing, over this issue. And we're always going to have abortion. There's just no question about that until Christ returns. Now, hopefully, we will not always have legalized abortion. Hopefully, Roe v. Wade will be overturned here. We should hear that Dobbs case ruling it sounds like in June. And hopefully, Roe will be overturned. Of course, that won't stop abortion, but what it will do is send it back to the states. And some states, I assume Nebraska would be one of those, have laws already in place that if Roe goes away, those states will become pro-life states. There will be other states that we'll still have to fight for. But even if that happens, and even if every one of the 50 states passed laws against abortion, it was completely illegal, there would be still some number of women who would get illegal abortions. Now, the number, I don't believe what the other side says, that, all these women are still going to get illegal abortions, so we ought to just keep it legal. That's a ridiculous argument. I think that's very demeaning to women. I think most women would be law-abiding citizens. They were prior to Roe, and I don't think there's any reason to think that they wouldn't be now. But I do acknowledge that there would be some number of abortions still being performed. That's discouraging. But I look at it this way. I'm just responsible to be faithful today. I want Roe to go away. I want every state to outlaw abortion completely. But in the meantime, I just want to be faithful because every human life matters. And maybe you and I, in our efforts, as small as they may be, or as big as they may be, maybe we'll be responsible for only saving a few. But I think God honors faithfulness. And I try not to look, too far out into the future about what's going to happen with Roe or what's not going to happen. I try to just look at what's in front of me. What can I be faithful to? So, yeah, we're probably always going to have some degree of abortion happening, regardless of what happens with our laws. But boy, we can have a huge impact, and we can change this world one baby at a time, and that should be enough to keep us going. Christ honors faithfulness, and we're doing it for him as much as we're doing it for the unborn.
Well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. That is really encouraging, just to be brought back to, God calls us not to control the outcome, but to be faithful. I just want to say I appreciate, Michael, your time today. We're going to go ahead and land the plane here. Again, we've been visiting with Michael Spencer. You can learn more about Michael and his ministry at LifeVoice.com. Really would encourage you to get the book Humanly Speaking by Michael. This has been 28 Minutes of Sanity. You can follow us on Twitter at 28MIN of Sanity, and you can send us a note, a question, even a disagreement, 28 minutes of sanity at gmail.com. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening today.